right, welcome everyone to Automate Compliance Through Modulation, IFRS 17. That's IFRS 17. My name is Connor Smith. I'm a Alteryx specialist at Data Meeting. Go through a quick little introduction slide regarding myself. Connor Smith, Alteryx specialist, Data Meeting. I do have my contact information if you want to email me any questions about this webinar or any other generic Alteryx questions you'd like to reach out with. Feel free to contact me. Also, my LinkedIn information. I'm always looking to add individuals to my network. I do want to talk a little bit about Data Meeting as we're getting into this discussion about automating compliance. Just tell you who we are at Data Meeting, what we like to do. Data Meeting is a boutique business intelligence BI consultancy firm. We offer end-to-end BI solutions. We have consultants in 13 states, 5 different countries. We actually got a good amount of resources offshores, but a good amount here in the US as well. Our services include business intelligence, data management, change management, delivery management, and education and training. In addition to partnering with Alteryx and being the Partner of the Year winner for 2021, we also have software partners such as AWS, Snowflake, Cloudera, Matillion, Tableau, Informatica, and Microsoft Azure. Let's jump into why we should automate compliance. I want to tell a story about a client of mine that came up and said they'd like to automate their compliance process. And their situation, they had a IFRS 17 and just IFRS 17, just so you're aware, is a new accounting requirement for insurance contracts. And they came up to me about October of last year, 2021, and said they'd like to put together an automation process to handle this accounting for insurance contracts. And what's interesting is they were asking me this in 2021, but this IFRS 17 rule, this compliance requirement, wasn't going to happen until 2023 in January. So they were really planning ahead. And a couple interesting facts of them planning ahead is they had already kind of figured out what they needed to do for compliance. But as they were putting together the white papers, as they're putting together the Excel sheets to do this compliance, they realized it was a very lengthy process. They realized this was going to take a lot of time and it was going to take a lot of technical know-how. And so that's kind of where they got the idea of, hey, if we automate this, we can reduce the amount of time, and then it doesn't take a lot of technical know-how for someone to go and press a button. So they took that technical expertise, came to me and said, let's automate this and let's see what kind of efficiencies we can get from it. Okay, no one likes a lot of work. No one likes to do repetitive manual tasks, and worse when they're technical and really important tasks. If you get them wrong, you end up with this massive tax liability. You end up with this litigations for not reporting appropriately. So that's where Alteryx comes into play. So why automate this new process? 3 bullet points that I've mentioned here is time savings, accuracies, and process flexibility. So as far as the time savings go, this particular client, they actually finished automating the process. They put it in production, and an estimate from them was they save over 28 hours on a monthly basis by simply being able to run this through Alteryx versus trying to manually go through this process. A couple of things about that with the time savings is not only did they save time in the normal execution of the process, but they also saved a lot of time on the rework of their steps. I'll give you an example, probably applicable to most of you. If you build an Excel process, if you build an Excel model and you have someone trained to rebuild that each and every month, there's often times where they're going to create their sum formula that only goes up to the top minus 1 row. So they get everything except for one value. And now they have this total at the very bottom that doesn't match the tie out number that they're trying to tie with. Okay, they may spend hours searching for why there's inaccuracies between this value and this value when it was simply a formula issue that they were having. Okay, so there's more than just the traditional process time savings, but there's also the time savings and not having to do a lot of that rework. That really brings us into that next bullet point there, accuracy. When you build an Excel model, you build an Excel an Alteryx workflow to do what you're already doing in an Excel model, that Alteryx workflow is going to be far more accurate than what you have in Excel, right? You can build it once and you know that no human error is going to come in as you start having to rebuild that each and every month, because you're not rebuilding it every month. You're not going to have those errors that humans create on a monthly basis. So that Excel, again, Alteryx model is going to process data far more accurately. And then you can also have checks and balances. And those checks and balances that you add into your Alteryx workflow aren't going to take extra time, right? If someone has to go through and manually review your Excel model to make sure everything was appropriate, you're going to add extra hours to your process. Whereas with an Alteryx workflow, you can add in these extra checks and balances at no additional cost, just that initial build cost. But execution each month, you're just pressing the run button, process time is going to be the same. And then of course, this final third bullet point that I want to talk about is process flexibility. This one's a big one, especially for the client that was kind of pre-planning for how they were going to handle their compliance. They were kind of still in the infancy stage in developing how to handle their IFRS compliance. Okay, they had an idea of what they wanted to do, but they didn't know exactly what all the steps were. So when I talk about process flexibility, I really am talking about that in two different ways. One is you can have the set steps that you need to go through for your compliance, but you can go and change a step pretty easily. And in your Alteryx workflows, you're not able to change that step. You're able to document, here's one version of the workflow before we did step A. Well, here's another version of the workflow when we started implementing that new step. Okay, so version 1, version 2. So you have version control between your processes, and you have this documentation of changes between those modules or models. Right? If you do the Excel workflow, if it's a manual step that someone goes through, you may have a list of tasks that someone's applying to this version, and you have a list of tasks that are now being applied to this version, but you don't have that same version control that you get when you work with Alteryx workflows. The second bit I'll share on process flexibility is the ability to rework and rework faster. So let's say you run your model in Excel and that model took someone 12 hours to put together. But now you realize the data wasn't right. There was actually this tweak or something had to be added to that data. You'd have to rerun that full 12-hour process again. So now you've doubled the execution time because you had to do that rework. With Alteryx, that's not the case. With Alteryx, if you need to rerun it, it only took you 2 minutes to run in the first place. If your input file changes, if your data changes, and you now need to rerun that process from end to end, 2-minute execution time, now you can see a lot of efficiency saved. So when I talk about process flexibility, you have this ability to not only go back and rework, but even change your process if needed. Okay, so a good example is maybe your data didn't change, but maybe you recognize there was an error. Let's say you recognize there's an error in your workflow and you've been running this workflow for 3 months. Well, going back and rerunning that workflow 3 times is going to be pretty tedious. If it's an Excel file, you have to rework this data 3 different times. But in Alteryx, you can make a slight change to your data and you can go run 2 minutes for the first month, 2 minutes for the second month, 2 minutes for the third month, and you just reworked in 10 minutes, 3 months worth of data that would have taken you over a week's time for those other 3 files. Okay, so a lot of flexibility there with your process as you automate and choose to automate your compliance processes here. So let's finish the story here, talk about some lessons learned with this client as we went to this compliance process. Actually, I'll show you a process flow. I'll tell you, being honest here, this is not my client's process flow. Obviously not. No one would in the right mind build a process flow that looks like this. But I'll say it this way, this is what I often see when I see someone's process flow for the first time. And I say that mentally, I just have to start working out and realigning things in my own mind to make sense of it all. The client for this particular project came out with a process flow. It was actually a 2-page process flow and said, this is what we'd like to automate in Alteryx. I'll be honest, this client came with a very well-organized process flow. A little overwhelming because it was 2 pages and you had to kind of straighten out where things were coming from, and a lot of this had question marks on it. But it was a great guide, and I think that's a great start to any Alteryx workflow that you're going to build, is have a general idea of where your data is coming from, where you want it to go, and what are the in-between steps to get there. If you have all that information, it makes it a lot easier to build an Alteryx workflow like this. The reason I'm sharing this slide is really to just have a discussion on decision making. When we initially looked at the client's process flow, we saw it and we said, do we want to do a single workflow, or do we want to chop this into little pieces and do multiple workflows? And the initial design decision was, let's just lump it all into a single Alteryx workflow. And so it can be ran on the server, single execution, may take 20 or 30 minutes to run, but it'd be completely and fully automated. Nobody has to touch it. And so that's the dream. That's what we went with, and that's what we started to build. And even though we took the single workflow approach, we ultimately did decide to take it one process at a time. So within that massive workflow, I'll kind of toggle back and forth here. We took a section of the workflow and we said, let's start here of this process flow. Let's start here and move this into Alteryx, one section of the workflow at a time. Okay. So as we did that, we started with this first process. So I'm going to label this process 1. And for process 1, there was a step that wasn't necessarily documented in their process flow. And it was a very important steps in terms of Alteryx because it really just changed the decision that we made at the beginning. We wanted a single workflow. This step in their process flow made us decide that maybe we should take a multi-workflow approach instead. And as I'm pointing to this step, some of you may already recognize that this is a Excel SM, which is an Alteryx or Excel enabled, Excel macro enabled workbook. Okay, so an Excel macro enabled workbook, meaning what? Meaning you can execute macros like a VBA macro in your Excel file. Okay, the reason this is a big step, I'll kind of explain it this way, is because the client had a process where they wanted to prepare all this data using Alteryx, load and write that data to this XLSM file, and then they wanted to go in and execute that macro. And then they wanted to pick up that data from the macro, put it back into Alteryx and keep running with it. So you can kind of start seeing where this can be a little bit of a problem because there's that almost manual execution step. Now, the client asked, well, is it possible, can we automate Alteryx to kick off this macro? So that kind of leads us into the next slide and whether or not Excel macros and Alteryx mesh together. The answer is yes, absolutely. You can use Alteryx to trigger your Excel macro. I'll share with you here for the video recording a link. You won't be able to click this, obviously, but if you just Google Excel macro Alteryx VBA, it's one of the first results. It'll take you to an Alteryx community article that documents exactly how to execute an Excel macro using an Alteryx workflow. Okay, so that's where that link takes you. But I will caveat this with some warnings. It's not without its issues, okay? Deploying your Excel macros using an Alteryx workflow on Alteryx server is challenging. Okay, and I'll give you some perspective. If you are executing a VBA macro on your server, that means you're going to have your Microsoft application installed on the server machine. If you have a multi-node instance of your server, you have to have your Microsoft application installed on multiple different nodes. So that way, whichever node picks up your workflow is going to be able to open up Excel and execute. If there's errors in your VBA code, no one's going to be there on the server to see them. So there's those sort of problems as well. In general, even if you're just deploying a Microsoft VBA solution on your desktop. So if you just want to create this workflow to run on your desktop, I'll mention there are hiccups there as well. And that's just scripting. Anytime you're writing code, you're going to run into problems. So if your code hangs, sometimes I've had Alteryx open up my Excel file and they just leave my Excel file open. Even though the workflow stops running, I now have this Excel file that's open in the background and I have no idea it's open. I can't figure out what's going on. So I have to go Control-D, go search for the file and then kill that Excel file. So just be aware that it's not without its hiccups, but it certainly is possible. I'll show you exactly how that's possible and kind of talk about, again, how this relates back to that client. The way it's going to work, the way Alteryx triggers VBA is actually through VBS. So this is Visual Basic Script. It's a different language from VBA for those of you who aren't aware. But the way this works, the way you can execute your Excel macro using Alteryx is through this coding language here. I've provided this an example script. This is the template. Again, this is what you can find on the community article. So feel free to go and download that. Or if you want to type out what you see on the screen, feel free to pause and read through that and figure out how to build that script. But the way the execution is run is using the run command tool and Alteryx here. And we're writing some example data to a CSV file. Technically, you could write this to a VBS and you could use Alteryx to dynamically build your VBS script. But in our case, we're just putting some random example.csv, not really relevant. This step can almost be ignored in this scenario. But just know that if you wanted to dynamically build your VBS script, you can build it, write it out through this configuration window, and then you can execute it down here. Now, the key points for this configuration is you want to execute it using the C script command. I think there's also a W script command that you could use. But then the arguments for that C script command is going to be a reference to your VBS file. So in this case, I got VBA_example.bbs. It's a relative path to where this workflow was saved, and it's going to execute this VBS script. And again, that VBS script that you're seeing here on the screen is that same file that's going to be executed. I will highlight kind of some details here. This, like I said, is a template file. You should only have to update the workbook path. So wherever your Excel file is, your XLSM Excel file, right, your macro-enabled workbook, wherever that is located, you'll want to update that path here as part of your VBS script. But you'll also want to update the macro name, so the actual macro you're attempting to execute. You can read through the rest of this code to kind of explore the possibilities and how it goes about opening that Excel file and triggering that macro, but all that's written just a few line of codes here. You can see there is documentation. Each one of these commas here is just a comment explaining to you exactly what this code is doing. All right, so let's move past that and talk about some issues that we experienced for this client when we were trying to trigger their macro. Any guesses on why this is an issue? If you look here on the right-hand side, do you remember, it looks like I got a typo in there, but do you remember to update your data, right? This is a user prompt that's inside of this macro. So the last screen showed us how we trigger the macro. This is the macro that we're triggering, and this macro that's being triggered is prompting here and asking the user for a response. Well, this is problematic because imagine if you built a workflow that you put on a server and you're asking a user for a response, nobody is on that server to answer that question. And so it would just hang. And in fact, when we were building this script, we got it all working. We got the Excel macro to kick off, and we sat there and watched Alteryx spin its wheels for 5.5 minutes. And we actually went to a different Alteryx workflow and we were building off a different portion of it. But we came back, we're like, why is it still spinning the wheels? Well, this should have executed the macro. Only takes like 10 seconds to execute. It should not be running for 5 minutes. And then we clicked around a couple times. We actually got this prompt to show up. It had popped up, but we just missed it because it was on a different screen. And so we got this message and we realized, well, this kind of puts a wrench in our plans because we can no longer use this route to execute this macro. Now, I'll talk about some of the issues we kind of talked through. And one was, well, why don't we just get rid of this macro? Or why don't we just get rid of this prompt and have the macro automatically execute? And that was certainly a viable solution, except for we didn't own the macro. And the clients I was working with did not own the macro either. They received the macro, they received this workbook with the macro involved with it from upstream. So they'd receive this data file, and they use this data file, process it through Alteryx to populate one of their sheets in this data file, and then they'd execute the macro in this data file. So if we adjust the macro, next month, they were just going to get a new Excel file with the same old dirty macro. Now, the end-all solution could have just been go back up upstream and tell somebody to fix their macro and get rid of this user prompt. But because that macro was being used for different departments, it wasn't possible for us to have that discussion. So that's where we finally just made our decision. We can't do this in a single workflow approach. Let's start modulating these workflows instead. So we're going to talk a little about modulation here and how it helped us automate their compliance process. We changed our decision. We said single workflow is not going to work. Let's break up that main workflow into 4 different sections. Okay. So again, this is just an illustration. I'll show you once we did break these out, once we built each of these individual sections as individual workflows and kind of got them all connected to one another, it became a lot easier to document our overall process flow, at least at a high level. You can already tell this gets a little bit easier once you kind of section these off to their own sections. But as I go to the next slide, you're going to see just how much clearer this can be once you've modulated your compliance process. So what I'm showing you here is that same massive, nasty workflow as individual steps reduced down to quite a lot fewer steps here. You can see process flow is that first workflow that we put together. And I highlighted green because this is the one that came in contact with that Excel file. So this process would run and then output to the macro enabled workbook, but does no longer does kick off that macro because we decided this needs to be manual. Someone has to execute on the machine. There's really no way to automate that because that box we'd have to check. Okay, so that's that first process. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is a couple points. Beyond the first process, we can also document the rest of these workflows that we also put together as their own little steps in an overall high level process flow. Okay, so we get process 1, 2, 3, and then I'll kind of have a little discussion around a shared process idea. And this is a unique benefit that you get here with a modulation approach as we break it into multiple different workflows. We were able to have two different input files. So process 1 created an output. An output actually had a completely different schema from process 3 here. So process 2 and 3, completely different outputs. But even though they had different schemas, we were able to pass those through this shared process here. And so because we built this modulation approach, process 2 could be loaded in and executed to the shared process. And then once we finished executing process 2, we then rerun that shared process and run process 3 through it. So we were able to build a single workflow that was applicable to two different file structures to create the same thing, or in this case, two separate outputs. Okay, so that's what I want to illustrate with this. We'll actually go into this shared process, talk about it a little bit, and see just some lessons learned again as we built out this shared process that was applicable to two input files. So this is that shared process. We kind of dumbed it down, right? Obviously, this isn't the same process that we use for the clients, but I brought together a live workflow that I can share, kind of illustrate some of the ways we can go about creating this shared process and then kind of the lessons we learned as we did it. Okay, so it is a really simple one. I will jump over here to that Excel file, that Alteryx file, and explore this shared process a little bit more. I'll press run here, get some data loaded, take a look at what we have, and I'll talk about the interface tools necessary to make this work. So I'll show you this setup here. We have a Excel file with example A. If I actually navigate here, you can see I have an example B as well. But you notice for example A, we have dates, product category, and sales. Okay. If I look at example B, I'll actually just switch it for a second. We're going to have, and I press refresh, we're going to have dates, expense category, and expense. Okay, so you can see a slight difference between those two files. I will flip it back to example A, press OK there, refresh that, make sure it's in good shape. This data, whether it's product category or expense category, is going to pass through a select tool. And as it passes through the select tool, product category and sales is going to be changed to the group by option, and it's going to be changed to the sum field name. Okay, the reason we're changing these is because now we take whatever values are coming in that we'd like to use, and we pass those values to a standardized naming convention. The standardized naming convention is then used to go through whatever steps you want to go through. So kind of explain this on a higher level, what we had to do for our client. It was actually, this wasn't just a single tool between this select and this select. It was actually a series, quite a few different tools that we had to go through and quite a few different fields that had to be standardized. So we standardized these fields to a single naming convention so we can then apply the same configuration to both example A as well as example B. Okay, once we've applied our manipulations to these standardized fields, we then use this next select tool to change those standardized fields back to the original names. Now it looks like I'm changing them to original names here, but the interface tool balance is really going to pick which fields should be renamed and then manages that, makes sure that those field names are changed back to the original names. In our case, I think we just pushed out through a browse tool here, but I can do a quick little illustration as I run this as an app, show you that the process we built works not just with example A, but also with example B. So I choose this one here. Let me actually navigate off screen for a second. I should be able to navigate to that input file, just pulling that up here. Perfect. Go to my shared process, got that navigated in, okay? And I'm gonna choose example A. We already know that one works. So I'm actually gonna choose example B, press OK. And now the app is configured for example B. I'm gonna choose for my group by field, I can choose my expense category. And for my sum field, I can choose my expense here, okay? So I get to manually map which fields from this input file are going to be my group by and which field is going to be my field that gets summed. When I press finish, the output here is going to show me that my expense field has been grouped by and my expense field has been summed. Okay. So you get the idea of how you can build a dynamic app that handles and really allows your user to decide which fields should be used for the generic process. A lot of possibilities here. You can build a pretty complex use case, and then you can have your user just map a handful of fields, and now their data doesn't have to match the format for your initial use case, but as long as you pass these mapping options up to your user through the interface, they'll be able to utilize your same application. Okay, so I will close this, circle back here to the PowerPoint, and wrap up with some best practices, as well as pros and cons. So a couple of pros and cons of modulation as we talk about breaking out into different, taking a single workflow approach and decide to break it out into multiple workflows instead. A couple of pros that we saw were that we were able to run a few steps of your process. So running just initial 1, 2, or step 1, 2, and 3 without having to go through 5, 6, and 7 as well. We were able to run that initial few steps when not all of our inputs were ready. So if we had built the whole process all in one, we would have had to have 20 or so input files before we could even start a little bit of our execution. But because we'd broken up into modulated workflows, we could, if we had the input files for the first 2 or 3 steps, we could go ahead and execute those steps, and then they'd write to a YXDV file to be used as inputs for the next steps 6, 7, and 8. Okay. It also gave us the ability to review results in between processes. So as we executed this, we could see what the results of the first step looked like and identify errors easier on, instead of having to run this massive workflow that took 30 minutes to run and then came back and said, oh, by the way, the first process threw an error, right? So in general, troubleshooting became a lot easier as well. The individual workflows can be represented as individual steps in your process flow. We kind of illustrated that on that earlier slide. A couple of cons we see, and often why we don't want to modulate, is the rerunning of workflows is more time consuming, right? It is a manual process to run one step after the next. Now there is ways to work around that, right? If you've ever worked with Alteryx server, there's a couple of ways you can chain the workflows together. So one workflow runs, once it's executed successfully, the next workflow then kicks off. But we did see this as we were operating on a desktop, that running those multiple workflows manually was more time consuming. Order of execution must be managed more carefully. You had to make sure you ran process 1 before process 2. If you try to run process 3 before process 1 was executed, right, you were likely picking up old data, so you could run into those, again, human errors if you mess up the order of execution there. And of course, if you are trying to schedule these and kind of manage the flow of everything, it can be more challenging to schedule this type of setup in Alteryx server. So a couple of cons that we saw, but now we'll move on to a few best practices for modulation. One best practice that I'll really emphasize is the ability to write to YXDB files and then read from those same YXDB files. So I've kind of illustrated it here on the screen. One of your workflows would write to a YXDB file, and then I should have drawn a line here. Your next workflow would then be able to pick up that same YXDB that you wrote to before and then run with that. So if you use YXDBs, it's easier to move data from one workflow to the next. I'll tell you just how fast that is to do, right? If I wrote to a YXDB, I should be able to right click, copy that YXDB file, paste it onto my own workflow. It's going to copy as an output file, but then I can right click that output file and I can click on it, convert to input data, and it'll convert that output file to an input data file. So it really is seamless to move data from that first workflow over to the second workflow. Another best practice regarding order of execution, it is a great idea to document the order of execution in the file names themselves, right? So if each of your different modulated steps is a different file, you want to add maybe a number right before the name of the file so you can keep track of, well, this step needs to run before this step, so on and so forth. So you can kind of know which one should be executed before the next. Anal collapse, as I already mentioned, can be chained together in the Interface Designer properties panel. So if you want it to have one workflow run right after the next, you'd go to the Interface Designer. Just note that if you're doing that, you're going to have YXWZ files. As far as I'm aware, there's no way to chain YXMD files together. So you will have to have app files in order to chain these apps one after the other. Where possible, you can indeed convert individual modulated steps into a macro and then use all those macros in a single workflow. So kind of illustrate this point for our client, we had all these different workflows we built, right? We can convert each of these to a YXMC file, and then we can drag each of these YXMC files onto a workflow and just chain them one after the next. So macro 1 would execute. Once it finishes executing, it would then go over to macro 2. Macro 2 would execute, and then we could run that into macro 3. I've personally seen this a lot in practice, so I'll mention that as a best practice because it certainly saves a lot of time as compared to trying to get this analytical app, chained app working together. Okay. As a summary for what we covered today, we talked about why to automate compliance, the kind of efficiencies, time savings, as well as more accuracy. Talked about the lessons we learned from modulating, the connections with the Excel files there, kicking off VBA macros, a couple of pros and cons of modulation, as well as covering those best practices. Thank you all, and feel free to email me with any questions, as well as reach out to Data Meaning if you'd like to hear more about what we can do for you. Cheers, everyone.